Hi everyone, welcome to another Screenwriter's Tips. My name is Tony DiGerolamo. I'm a screenwriter, and this time we're going to talk about the James Bond movies. Okay, the great thing about the James Bond movies from a screenwriting perspective is the structure of the screenplays, because they're a formula that works. You always have the opening, the action opening that goes into the credit sequence, that leads into Bond going to get his assignment from M, which gives you all the exposition up front. You've got the gadget assignment from Q, and then Bond's often running to some exotic locale to see how he could find out more about this evil villain. The second act is mostly him seducing a girl and getting involved with the villains in some way until finally he pushes his luck too far. And by the end of the second act, he's in trouble or being hunted by the henchmen. The third act, of course, by that time, he's usually like at the bottom of a scorpion pit or something and has to escape in order to stop some sort of death ray. And in the end, of course, he puts it all together using luck, the gadgets, the girl, and manages to save the day. And then the denouement is, everybody's safe, and they go to pick Bond up, and he's having sex with the girl in a raft somewhere floating on the ocean. And that's the basic structure of Bond. And the great thing about it is the good movies, they play within that structure, right? You've got different girls, different gadgets, different villains, different henchmen. And, the better movies make them colorful and fun. And some of the other movies, not so much. Sometimes they try to do things that don't work. I think the main problem with the Bond movies as they are now is the same problem with, it's not really a problem with the geopolitical field. There is no Soviet Union. Bond was a product of the Cold War. That's the way he was written. That's the way he worked. And if you'll look at the Bond movies, after 1989, there's a 6-year gap until the next one in 95, and that's when the Soviet Union was gone, and by 95 it was definitely gone, not coming back. And by that time the movie makers had to take Bond somewhere else, and due to various legalities they didn't have Spectre anymore. Spectre didn't come back until Quantum of Solace, and they had to somehow create a villain for Bond, and it just really, for me, hasn't worked. I've seen most of the Bond movies. I've missed a few of them, but, you can't, for my money, beat Sean Connery's Bond. Roger Moore had his moments, certainly. Even George Lazenby's movie isn't totally unwatchable. But the modern Bonds, other than maybe Casino Royale, which is based on an Ian Fleming novel, they're missing that important detail. And there's a reason why, if you look at a TV show like Archer, why in Archer the Soviet Union still exists, at least in the beginning of the show. It's because it gives the heroes a big enough villain to fight against, an organization, a network. And that's what you need for spies. It's the only way they work. I think what the filmmakers should do with Bond at this point is they need to reboot the entire franchise, take it back to the 60s, the early 60s, and that's where Bond lives. And from then on, it's just a period piece. Then you could do everything that Bond does. You won't have to hear from the PC police. You can say, well, that was the early 60s. What are we supposed to do? You can have the smoking and the drinking and the womanizing. You could have all the spy stuff, all the killing, and there would be, real things at stake in those movies. Now, if you look at a movie, I think it was The Living Daylights, where Bond goes up against the drug cartels, didn't work. Or maybe that was a different one. I know that was a Timothy Dalton one. I don't know, I'm getting those confused. But, by that time, even by the late Roger Moore, early Tim Dalton ones, the Soviet Union was still around, but it wasn't really a threat anymore. People were so used to it, it didn't feel like a threat. So in the early 60s, the Soviet Union still had some juice, still had some, there was still a threat there that felt palpable on the geopolitical stage. The problem with the stage today is, on the one hand, you have the PC police that they don't want you to do certain things. They don't want certain groups of people portrayed as villains because that, to them, looks racist. And just in general, there are real-world governments that will probably get pissed off if you release movies like that. They won't show those movies in their home countries. And so Hollywood stays away from them because they're afraid of losing business. Because Bond, don't forget, is a world phenomenon. So, unless you're going to do a Bond movie in which he helps the Chinese government, you're going to lose market share if you're not careful. There's also, there's very few other countries that can stand up against the West in any kind of credible way that feels real in a movie. You can maybe add the Saudis to your list now after the Khashoggi murder, but even now, like, I don't know if Hollywood would want to depict a rogue Saudi prince. I think it would make a great movie because I think a rogue Saudi prince would have the resources to be a Bond villain, because you need that money and a plan to whatever he's going to do. But, back in the era of Sean Connery, it was easy to demonize the Soviet Union. Everybody was on board with that. The entire Western audience didn't have a problem if you demonized the Soviets. They were bad. They were communist. We were fighting them. The Soviet Union got up every day and said, we're going to destroy you Western capitalist pigs. So, your audience has no problem. If you do the Saudis, there will be some Saudis who say, well, that's not fair, and that doesn't portray all Saudis, and you'd have to throw in a few Saudi characters who were good to balance it out. But I don't know, it's more complicated. Whereas if you set it back in the past, there's nothing complicated about it, and you can get to the cool stuff that everybody wants to see. So, from a screenwriting perspective, what can you learn from Bond? You can learn that structure helps, that by following that structure, you don't have to be limited. I mean, you could do a lot of stuff within that structure, Yes, the structure itself is limited. I mean, obviously, it's a danger because to do stuff about Bond's character arc really doesn't get you much. Because if you look at the movies where that's happened, that tends to be the later movies and the George Lazenby movie that didn't do well, on Her Majesty's Secret Service. That was really the first Bond movie that did poorly, which is why Lazenby didn't do any more Bond movies. The studio was like, uh-oh. Which is a shame, but that's the movie where Bond gets married. So it kind of undermines the Bond character because he's so iconic to do something like that. He's like Batman and Superman. He's an icon. We're not there to see the icon struggle with his day-to-day life. We don't want to see that. We want to see the icon do what icons do. The iconic things that Bond does. We want to see him gamble. We want to see him order his martini. We want to see him seduce the girl. We want to see him win at everything. That's just the way it is. That's the whole reason to go see a James Bond movie. It's part of my problem with Quantum of Solace. Hands down, the worst Bond movie ever made, in my opinion. Quantum of Solace tries to deconstruct the entire Bond franchise and fails at every turn, despite the fact that they bring back Spectre. It just, it's not. To me, it's not a Bond movie. It's just awful. If you ever get a chance to see Quantum of Solace, do yourself a favor, just skip it and go watch all the old Connery movies and Live and Let Die. Those to me are the best. You can't get any better than that. You know, not that Daniel Craig and Casino Royale. I'll add Casino Royale because that, you know, that one stands above for Daniel Craig because it's based on the Ian Fleming novel, and there's a lot to draw from in those novels, even though the social, the geopolitical, you know, landscape changed. You know, there was still enough in there to make it cool, and to make it feel like there was a lot at stake. So, you know, in terms of if you're going to write a spy caper, just like anything else, you got to do your research and you got to decide, you know, what kind of spy caper is this going to be? You know, in the era of Bond, at the highlight, it was all about the girls, the gadgets, the guns. These days, you know, people treat things, in my view, way too seriously. The great thing about Bond was there was a seriousness to Bond. There was. I mean, there was something at stake there. You didn't feel like Sean Connery was joking around. Now, if you look at the later Roger Moore stuff, it got very campy. Very campy. And a little too campy, in my view. But there still was a danger in some scenes. There's a balance that you have to create when you make a movie like that, I think. And that balance is you're going to have some fun scenes, you're going to have some serious scenes, you're going to have some sexy scenes, and that should gel in a way that comes to a climax and everybody can walk out of the theater with, oh, that was fun, or that was cool, or that was hot, or whatever. You know, it's a little for everyone. As opposed to now, I think they tend to treat the plot far too seriously. There's no jokes in there of any merit because they're so desperate to sell you on the concept. They're missing opportunities. Like, I'll give you an example. In Skyfall. Skyfall, to me, was a huge opportunity for the people who were making the Bond movies that they just dropped the ball on. And the opportunity was this. Skyfall is Bond's home, right? It's where he grew up. And then he goes back there and there's a big fight scene or whatever. It's not a great movie. But when Bond goes back, he meets the groundskeeper. Now, the groundskeeper is an older guy. That was an opportunity for the screenwriters to say, hey, here's something we could show the audience. This is a guy who maybe influenced Bond, right? We could make this groundskeeper the guy who showed Bond how to be cool with women, or showed him how to shoot, or showed him, you know, one of the many skills that Bond used in his spy career that made him the man he was. But unfortunately, I didn't see any of that in Skyfall. And I think that was a real missed opportunity to ground the Bond character in something other than just, you know, the gadgets and whatnot. It could have been a character that could have come back, could have been a mentor that he called, you know, somebody who could be threatened down the road by one of the many villains, or you know, it would have been great. A guy like that could have been played by Sean Connery. You know, I think he was getting on in years by that time, maybe too old to play it, but that would have been awesome. You know, Connery's just so iconic as Bond. I mean, if you look at a movie like The Rock, where it's really supposed to be James Bond, got arrested and ended up at Alcatraz and, you know, had to serve his time and then has to go back. There was a whole like Bond tie in there that was great. You know, it's just very hard to beat him. He was so great in the role. They need someone like that. I think Craig is pretty close, but you know, Bond or Connery also had, again, the great scripts based on the Ian Fleming novels. Maybe they need some really good novels or something. But again, I would go back to the period piece, and I'd set Bond back in his heyday at the Cold War. I think that's where he worked the best, and I think there's a lesson to be learned in taking a franchise and running it too long. You know, I mean, I think at this point, the Bond franchise, the Star Wars franchise, a few other franchises, they're getting really long in the tooth. And now, you know, they failed to be what they were about. And to some extent, they were about the people who made those roles great. And when those people pass on or are too old to play them, you know, it's maybe it's time to pack it up and do something new. You know, instead of squeezing every dollar out of it until people are just sick to death of it, you know? Anyhow, that's my opinion. That's it for screenwriting tips today. If you have some tips you'd like me to cover, please put a suggestion in the comments section. Please vote this up. Go to my Patreon. I also do the Webcomic Factory and Superfat if you like web comics. My name is Tony D, and thank you for joining me on Screenwriter's Tips.